I really apologize for the delay. We had some technical difficulties. But please welcome Tim Kamin. He's our presenter this afternoon for lawful interviewing practices or tips for effective and legal employment practices. He's going to be talking to us this afternoon about how to interview employment applicants without getting into hot water. So I'm going to hand it over to Tim at this point. He's a partner at Ogletree Deacon Law Firm here in Milwaukee. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. Today we want to talk, as she said, a little bit about lawful interviewing techniques and some subject matter to avoid and some best practices to use. Do you want to?
Yeah, I can.
We're going to discuss basically a number of key points. I mean, I think the primary one, since I'm a lawyer, we're going to talk about whether it's legal to ask certain types of questions and what questions are not legal to ask. Do we really want to know the answer to some of the questions we may want to ask? Because everything we know could be assumed to be a factor in our decision. Are the questions we're asking related to the job that we're hiring? And we want to be consistent across the board so that we're treating each applicant the same way, that we don't have special questions for people depending on their special status. And then we want to document the process to the best we can, whether that's having a script going in and sort of recording the answers with some notes and things like that. So those are the general strategies we're going to talk about here. So in terms of conducting an interview, what we want to do typically is to give the applicant an overview of the interview process and the hiring process. So explaining to them, we're meeting with a number of applicants. Here's the timeline in which we expect to get back to you. You know, do you anticipate a second round of interviews, or are you going to be making a decision based on the initial interview? What other elements are you going to have to the hiring and evaluation process, and when do you expect to make a decision? We just want to set the expectations for the individual going through the process. We want to explain the essential job functions and working conditions, attendance requirements, the working schedule, everything we can share about the job. We want to provide that information. And then we're going to ask open-ended questions that give the person a chance to talk. I know there are going to be some yes or no questions that we need to ask, but we want to filter in some good open-ended questions, inviting the applicant to speak and communicate some ideas and see how well they can, you know, process information and communicate information. And we don't want to set expectations too high. We don't want to imply during the interview that we're going to make a job offer or anything like that. The purpose of the interview is to gather information and share information. We make decisions later. So in terms of promising a timeline that we can't meet or implying that we're going to make a job offer when we haven't interviewed all the candidates and haven't evaluated all the information yet, we want to avoid. So first we're going to start with, is it legal? We're going to ask questions that are related to the job, not general questions about a person's, you know, background or personality or political persuasions or family life or things like that. And we're going to avoid questions around sensitive areas. I know my grandmother taught me it's not polite to talk about politics and religion at dinner, but you know, there are a number of other subjects that we'll talk about avoiding.
Okay.
This one I think clicks individually. So. Here's the general theme that we want to keep in mind when we have a question that's just burning in our mind and we're trying to decide whether to ask it. Once we ask a question that's improper under the law, the applicant knows that we've asked the question, the applicant answers the question, they're going to assume whatever hiring decision we make is going to be based on that. So if we ask an illegal question, the applicant answers the question, and we end up not extending a job offer to that individual, right or wrong, they're automatically going to assume, aha, that's why they didn't hire me. And that's where we get into some legal trouble and have claims. So here's some of the problem areas. You can just tick off a few of these. But obviously, age, disability, race, national origin, sex, religion, pregnancy, marital status, child care responsibilities, arrest and conviction record in the state of Wisconsin. All of these things, sexual orientation in the state of Wisconsin, all of these are factors about an individual that are what we call a protected category, meaning we are not allowed to make an employment decision based upon any of these factors. These are supposed to be non-factors in our decision, and we'll talk about some of these individually a little bit. So on an individual's name, something as simple as a name can be somewhat problematic, or how they want to be talked to. Now, we can always ask a person for their full name. We can always ask them if there are any work records in their history that are under a different name. Sometimes this can go to marital status. Traditionally in our culture, females getting married have changed their last name. It's certainly not the case as much as it used to be. But so sometimes asking if some of your employment records are under a different name can actually be inquiring to a female candidate if they've ever been married. Those two questions often go hand in hand, but in this case, if you're just asking if employment records may be under a different name, you have every right to ask that question. It is unacceptable to ask if you're a Miss, Mrs., Ms., or ask for a maiden name, because now we're getting into areas that are not relevant to them performing their job. On race, color, and physical description, there's been a lot of research done in this area on looking at names alone, and that a name on a resume may indicate in someone's mind a particular race or national origin. But we're not allowed to require a photograph with an application, and we're not even really allowed to request, if you want, submit a photo with your application. I would love to be able to do this. I've been through scenarios where for example, our law firm may hire a summer associate, and we may interview 10 or 12 candidates for that position, and we may do all 10 or 12 interviews in a period of 2 or 3 days. And you have a stack of resumes and a stack of letters, and after you get out of these meetings, you can't remember who is who. And so I actually had an incident with and so if you had a photograph of each person, it's really easy to remember, oh, now I can connect this resume with the conversation that I had with this individual that I remember seeing. Very dangerous to do. We actually have a case for a client right now who shall remain nameless, where one of the issues that came out in the case in discovery was that the individual conducting the interviews was making notes on the resumes for that very reason, trying to remember who was who. Well, was writing things like 5'10", blonde, attractive, or African American, which was not being used by the individual to decide who to hire, but rather just to remember who they had met with and which notes pertain to which person. Because you can't always remember the face with the name, but if you could write the description on there, well, obviously that kind of information can be used by a plaintiff who believes that they've been discriminated against to say, look, they were recording my race or they were recording my appearance, and that's why they were making the decisions that they were making. National origin and ancestry, obviously with the amount of immigration and people moving across borders in our country, this is becoming more and more of an issue. So we can't ask about their birthplace, their parents, grandparents, or spouse birthplace, or any other inquiry into national origin of any kind. Citizenship, it is acceptable to ask if the person is authorized to work in the United States. So that is, the I-9 certification that we're obligated to complete. It's unacceptable to ask if somebody is, a native-born citizen of what other countries they may be a citizen of, unless it's somehow related to the job. If you're going to have somebody engaged in international travel, it may be relevant. Or a requirement that they produce naturalization papers, meaning that they are trying to become a citizen versus being legally authorized to be present in the United States and work in the United States. On the subject of religion, there's a lot of action over this issue right now. There are certain faiths that require breaks throughout the day to pray at different times. There are certain religions that require days off or time off to worship at specific times. Some religions are more flexible than others. So, for example, we have Catholic churches in Milwaukee that often have a couple different times on Sunday you can go. If you want to go on Saturday nights, you can. Some have Mass on Wednesday nights. So, I mean, if you're a Catholic in Milwaukee, you can probably find a church service around your work schedule in most scenarios. But if you happen to be Muslim and you have to pray at specific times during the day, that may present a different conflict to be resolved. So it is acceptable to explain to the applicant what days, hours, and shifts are expected, and to ask them if they are available to work those shifts or if they believe they can be present and attend. But you can't ask them specifics about their religious beliefs, what their affiliations, any holidays or days of the week that they observe with specificity. You can't ask those questions. On military status, it's definitely acceptable to explore somebody's military background in the U.S. Armed Forces, including positions held, branch of the forces that they served, and the rank. Any job-related experience that they may have gained. Many people gain mechanical and other industrial experiences in the military, and also in the military discharge certification to verify their status upon discharge. It's unacceptable to ask about military service for other countries. Regarding an individual's physical condition, this is a very touchy area, and especially in the kind of industry that we're in. We certainly have physical requirements for a job. This isn't just sitting at a desk and using a computer. So we can't ask disability-related questions. We can't ask an individual if they have any particular conditions or diseases. We can't ask whether they're going to need an accommodation to perform their job, with a couple of narrow exceptions. Obviously, if somebody comes in a wheelchair, we can see that they're in a wheelchair, that they may have a need for accommodations in terms of wheelchair access for the work that they perform. Then you can openly discuss that, because you're not asking anything that you're not asking them to reveal anything about themselves that you don't already know. Or if the applicant voluntarily discloses a disability, if in the middle of the interview the individual just says, by the way, I'm diabetic and I have to monitor my blood count and I have to administer insulin and things like that, then obviously if they start the conversation, we can go into it. And there are also no medical examinations allowed at the pre-hire stage. So these rules apply to the point in time when we're evaluating the applicant, we're interviewing the applicant, but we haven't made a job offer yet.
So Tim, you know, this job in particular can have some pretty rigorous physical requirements, like lifting heavy weights and things like that. How can you lawfully get at whether a person can perform those requirements of the job without getting into trouble in this area?
That's a great question. We'll get into that right now, and we're really talking about the post-offer stage.
Okay.
So the post-offer of employment, at that point, once we've made an offer of employment, we can make what's called a conditional offer and say, based upon your work history, your experience, your training, you seem to be a very good candidate. We're going to conditionally offer you employment subject to further discussion, and we need to know if there's any if there's any kind of medical restrictions or anything like that. If we have any kind of physical testing that we want to do, those have to be done post-offer. And the concept being that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires us to sort of isolate that issue. So you can't put a person through those paces and then after that say, well, we're not going to hire you, but it's not because of your physical condition, it's because of something that was in your resume or something that happened in the interview. Basically what the law requires us to do is make the conditional job offer, so express that we are willing to hire the person based on what we know. Then if something comes out during any kind of medical exam process or during a physical testing process that changes our mind, it will be obvious that our decision was because of the medical test or the physical test. And at that point, if they want to take issue with it, it's clear the basis of our decision.
So you can't, before offering them a job, ask them a question like, this job may require you to lift weights of up to 50 pounds. Is there any reason you couldn't do that?
You can ask those questions.
Okay.
You can't say, do you have any kind of disability that would prevent you from lifting 50 pounds? Okay. But you can say, are you generally capable of lifting 50 pounds? And those types of questions.
Okay. Okay.
And then here when we get to physical data, it's acceptable to require the applicant to demonstrate their ability to perform tasks that are related to the job. It's often best to have them even attempt to perform things that are, very specific to the job. So, sometimes if there is lifting of 50 pounds required, but it involves, lifting a crate onto a truck, you may want to have them demonstrate lifting a crate onto a truck because it's very job related. You're not testing their physical condition generally. You're testing whether they're physically capable of performing tasks that are related to the job. It's unacceptable, though, to ask sort of non-specific job-related physical data, like height, weight, those types of things. So here's some questions that we can ask at this stage, which is, can you meet the attendance requirements of our job? Here's what we require. And if the person has a physical or health condition that's going to prevent them from attending on a regular basis, it's the time to have that conversation. You can ask, how many days did you take leave last year? How many Mondays or Fridays were you absent last year? So you can explore their ability to attend work in that way of asking historical fact questions. But you can't ask how many days were you sick, how many days did you miss because of a medical condition. We need to keep it more general. So we don't want to discriminate against somebody who has absences because of a medical condition versus somebody who just misses work a lot for other reasons. They should be treated the same. Physical data, it's acceptable to ask if the applicant currently uses illegal drugs because there's no protection for using illegal drugs. But it's unacceptable to ask if the applicant has a history of drug or alcohol addiction or other problem. That can be considered a disability if it's historical. You can't ask them about prescription drugs they're taking. I mean, that asks them to reveal information about their physical state. It's unacceptable to ask questions about their general medical condition. So generally we're focusing on what you're capable of doing, not what conditions do you have that interfere with your abilities. And it's unacceptable to ask questions about workers' comp. You know, what's your workers' comp history? Have you filed a workers' comp claim? Those kinds of things. With education, we can basically ask just about everything about their educational background, with the exception of asking them for graduation dates that would reveal their age. So we're not allowed to ask about age, and you don't want to ask, well, what year did you graduate from high school, which for most people that gives you a pretty darn good idea of what their age is. References, you can always ask about if they have references that are willing to vouch for their professional abilities or their character, and we can always ask if somebody referred them for a job. So those are pretty safe questions. On arrest and conviction record in the state of Wisconsin, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail here, but it is acceptable to ask an applicant in Wisconsin so far. It's still acceptable to ask an applicant if they've ever been convicted of a crime. It's also acceptable to ask if there are any current pending unresolved charges. So we can evaluate those two things, prior convictions where they've been found to have committed a crime, or current pending charges where there has been no disposition yet. What we're not allowed to ask is if you've ever been arrested. Because if somebody's been arrested but not convicted of a crime associated with the arrest, it's illegal to use that in our judgment. More on Wisconsin's law regarding arrest and conviction record is that we can use a prior criminal conviction as a basis for a hiring decision or a decision not to hire an applicant, as long as the criminal offense that they've been convicted of is substantially related to the job. And so this is pretty difficult, but what we can ask is we can ask questions about the circumstances of the crime and the conviction to determine if it is in fact related to the type of job we're asking them to do. Now, if it was a situation where, you know, theft is typically fairly job related, because in most jobs people will have an opportunity to commit theft. And so if somebody has a history of theft and you're going to be sending them into a, you know, a third-party controlled job site, a customer plant, those types of locations, they're going to have access to equipment and, you know, the customer's property, our property. So those types of things are typically related. You know, in my personal experience dealing with clients, one of the most difficult issues for people to deal with in this area is you get an applicant who has been convicted of child molestation. And, you know, the client calls and says, do I have to hire this person? And you go through the discussion, and, you know, most of the time the answer is, well, you can't legally use that as the basis for declining to hire the person. Obviously, if the job is one that would leave the individual in the presence of children, then that would be substantially related to the job. But if you have somebody, so if somebody has a conviction for child molestation and they're applying to be a janitor at a school or to work at a daycare center, those or a retail store where children are present, obviously those could be substantially related, and the employer may say, you know what, I'm not going to take that risk. If you're running a factory where there's no children and there's no children nearby and the person's going to be supervised every day, and it's pretty difficult to make a tie that that criminal conviction is somehow related to operating a machine on third shift in a factory where there are no children present. And it's pretty difficult to swallow. And there may be other legal reasons to reject the applicant. They may not have the work history that you're looking for, but you can't discriminate on that issue.
So, that being the case, do you have an opinion as to whether it's better to even ask about prior convictions?
Yeah, and that's where you kind of get into the rock and a hard place. Because if you don't ask, you don't know, which means you can't be accused of discrimination. But if you don't ask, you don't know. And that's the downside is not only could you be bringing somebody dangerous into your workplace who may have a history of dealing with conflicts by committing violent acts, by using dangerous weapons. That's how they resolve conflicts in their life. Bringing somebody like that in the workplace could not only be obviously very dangerous, we have a moral obligation to protect our employees and customers from dangerous people, but also we have a legal liability to take reasonable measures to keep our workers safe, to keep our customers safe. And we're hiring people without asking the question, and you place somebody with a significant history of convictions of violent assault and place them in a high-stress job around other people and something bad happens, we could be accused of negligent hiring, negligent supervision, and putting that person in that situation when, if we had known and had done our diligence, we wouldn't have done that. So generally speaking, I like to err on the side of asking and then just being very careful about the decisions that we make.
Okay.
When you do, can you ask a generic question? Like, in our business, background checks are often necessary. Our customers demand them of our workforce. So could you say something to the effect of, hey, background checks are often necessary as a condition of employment? Is there any reason why you would have a problem? Can you ask a generic question?
Yeah.
I don't need to know the details.
Right, and if it's a potential requirement of the job that the person go through a background check, and I don't think we get into this in detail here, but we are permitted to do general background checks. Under the law, if you hire a third party to conduct a background check, that's considered a consumer report, and under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, we actually have to have the applicant sign a consent form. And so we can make that a condition of the application process to say you need to sign a consent form to allow our third-party vendor to perform the background check. And obviously, if you don't sign the form, then you won't be considered an applicant for the job. We can also notify them that there are specific job assignments where our customers require us to have a background check before we can send you to their property, right? And in those situations, I think in the job interview, it's perfectly legal to clarify to them that this will be required in the future. And do you have any objection to that, or is there any reason? Yeah. On foreign language skills, which can be very useful in a great many number of occupations, it's fully acceptable to ask, what languages are you capable of reading, writing, communicating in verbally, and especially if it's job related. If you have, customers and environments that involve people that speak different languages, can be extremely useful and job related. But it's generally unacceptable to ask, well, what's your native language, or how did you learn to speak Spanish? Those kind of questions start to drive at, where were you born, where are you from, what's your ethnic background, which are things we don't necessarily need to know to make a hiring decision. On the subject of sex, obviously we're not typically asking people what their gender is, but there may be circumstances where there's uncertainty, and particularly where you're uncertain, I guess I would put it this way: if you have to ask, don't ask. Is probably the safest rule. But what we're really talking about are not just sex, the fact that somebody's male or female, but other questions that the EEOC and our courts have found to be so closely identified with gender that they're discrimination by sex by simply doing that. So one of these is are you pregnant, are you expecting? Pregnancy is obviously a nature of the female of the species, and so that's a question that targets women differently than men, obviously, and we have laws against pregnancy discrimination. Not only is it a violation of pregnancy discrimination law, but it can be a violation of sex discrimination, what the EEOC considers sex plus, characteristics that pertain to one gender and not the other. So childbearing plans, well, I see that you're, married, do you have kids, are you going to have kids, those kind of questions. Those are also illegal, and generally because, you know, there are certain presumptions about child and family responsibilities, and often those presumptions and prejudices are also biased by sex. That if, you know, in the traditional belief system in our culture, if a man has children, he's probably going to work a lot to pay for them, and if a woman has children, you know, the bias has been that she's probably going to have obligations to be away from work to take care of the family. So those things have been proven to be cultural biases and things that we don't want to wade into in an interview. And on that note, you know, the EEOC has undertaken kind of a pretty significant initiative attempting to establish a body of law that says, you know, discrimination against caregivers for children is discrimination by sex. It's what they call sex plus. And it sort of has there's kind of a yin and a yang to it. As it pertains to female applicants and female candidates, it's the presumption that if you have children, you're not going to be available, and you're going to miss work when the kids are sick, and you're going to need to get home to make dinner, and all of the things that those biases assume about working women. On the flip side, when it comes to men, if there is a man who does take a lot of active role in childbearing, and not childbearing, but child rearing, and going home, and you know, if a man wants to call in because the child is sick and the man's going to stay home, men can often face an additional backlash for that because their employer may not consider that an appropriate behavior for a male, whereas it may be for expected of a female employee. But if you're a man, we don't expect you to do that. And so the EEOC really looks at these issues where an employee suffers adverse consequences in a context of interviewing. If we're asking somebody, do you have children, do you have responsibility for taking care of children, and then we don't hire the person, that leaves us open to an accusation that we're discriminating against an applicant because of our concern about their child care obligations. So marital status and family responsibilities, generally things we want to stay away from. Questions like, do you have children? Who cares for your children while you're working? You know, marital status, married, single, divorced. Do you plan to get married? I know, you know, talking with classmates of mine from law school, you know, some of them actually got outright illegal questions from law firms about, you know, are you planning to have kids? You know, law firms very openly and illegally may not want to hire and invest a lot of time and energy in somebody who's going to take a maternity leave in, you know, 8 months and may or may not return. And those things do happen. But it's illegal to discriminate on that basis and to inquire. Regarding relatives, we don't necessarily want to inquire into someone's family relationships, but you know, the limitations of this area generally are we're allowed to let people know that that we have a policy against people who are related supervising one another or working together in certain categories, and that we can ask them if they have any relatives that are already working for our company. In some cases that may not be apparent, that you're maybe going to offer a job to the boss's nephew or the supervisor in the area's nephew, and you may have a policy that precludes that supervisor from supervising a relative, so you have the right to ask the applicant, you know, give us the names of anybody who works here that you are related to. But beyond that, we're not asking them, give us a list of all your relatives.
So Tim, just to backtrack for a second, I mean, let's say that, you know, during the course of the interview, you're just trying to be friendly and chat, and you like find out that somebody went to the same high school you did, and you ask them, oh, what year did you graduate? And then you don't hire that person for a reason unrelated to their age. They're just not qualified, or there's a better qualified applicant. I mean, what ability do you have to defend yourself if you get a discrimination based on age lawsuit to say, no, that wasn't actually the reason that I chose not to hire him?
Right. What that will do is it'll sort of what I'll call join the issue on the subject of age, which is they asked me the question about when I graduated from high school, I answered the question. So they knew my age and then didn't hire me. So that's sort of what we call a prima facie case, where the complainant has to make out a basic circumstantial case that they may have been discriminated against. Well, then that shifts the burden to the employer to say, no, yes, that's true. I knew how old they were. I knew when they graduated from high school, and I didn't hire them. But here's the real reason why. But it does put a burden on us to demonstrate that reason. The much easier defense is to say, I didn't know their age. But, you know, most people, when you have a face-to-face interview, you're going to draw some kind of conclusion about what you believe a person's age to be. And, you know, the line of demarcation under the Age Discrimination Employment Act is 40 years old. So you can look at somebody in their 30s or 40s, and you may not know exactly which side of the 40-year-old line they land on. But if you meet with somebody who's 19 or somebody who's 75, you're going to have a pretty good idea just by meeting them, and asking them when they graduated from high school may not be an issue. But it's certainly just not something we want to put front and center. Like I said, by asking the question, it puts that in the applicant's mind that, oh, it matters to this employer what my age is and why. Why did they ask me that? So it just sort of puts a seed in there. But you're right, it can come up that if we went to the same school and you believe the person is roughly the same age, or maybe the same age as a relative of yours or a friend of yours, you may, you know, naturally ask that question. If you were just meeting somebody in a different context, you may ask that question. And yeah, you end up having to defend yourself a little differently.
So a follow-up question to that, I mean, because I can see how it would be kind of easy to accidentally wander into unlawful territory, especially the stuff relating to kids and child care responsibilities. Would you recommend that to avoid accidentally wandering into hot water, that you have sort of a pre-prepared list of questions you ask and then you never deviate from it? Or okay.
It's nice to have a scripted outline of subjects that you want to cover to make sure that you're covering the same subject matter with all applicants, that you're not missing anything that you intended, that when the person walks out, you don't say, oh, I forgot to ask this question. Mm-hmm. But that's not to say that you don't, quote-unquote, go off the script a little bit, or there may be an answer that you get that requires a follow-up question. You know, do you have any military service? And they say no, well, that's certainly the end of that. But if they say yes, then you may have a couple more questions about what branch they served in, what kind of jobs they did, you know, what the status of their discharge was. So, I mean, there are times to branch off, and there are going to be times when an applicant says, oh, my son plays baseball with this person's son at the company, or something like that, and they're going to disclose that they have kids. And the best thing to do is to, you know, sort of acknowledge that, don't be rude about it, but then don't ask the follow-up questions like, oh, well, how many kids do you have? And, you know, are you married? And who takes care of your kids? And do you find it difficult to attend work every day and taking care of kids? I mean, that's what you don't want to do.
Okay.
And so you want to keep it, you know, if they casually offer some personal information, you know, casually acknowledge it, but don't let the interview start to focus on that subject.
Okay, thanks.
On residence, one would think that this wouldn't be too complicated, but it can be. It's definitely acceptable to ask them where they live and how long they've lived there and those kind of things. It sort of gives us an idea of their general background, how much they move around, are they going to be here. What's unacceptable is to ask if you own or rent your home, because the EEOC has statistical data showing that there are certain groups of people that are more likely to own homes and others that are not as likely to own homes. And to make a decision based on that actually discriminates against particular groups, in fact, even if it's not the intent. And then there's making inquiries into foreign residences. Have you ever lived in a foreign country? Those types of questions are not appropriate. On the statement of age, we talked about this a little bit, but you know, we can let them know that their employment will be subject to verification that they meet age requirements. You know, in most jobs it's going to be 18. There are some jobs that have different age requirements. So we can ask if an applicant's 18 or older if that's what the job requires. It's unacceptable to ask for dates of birth, and as mentioned before, dates of a completion of school that's closely associated with age, like when did you graduate from high school. Asking about ages of children, and obviously we can't ask that they submit a birth certificate or baptismal record or anything else that indicates a date of birth. We can ask obviously for a notice in case of an emergency, but obviously only after we've made an offer of employment and they've been hired. Organizations, this one doesn't sound like it should be too tricky, but it can be. If we're going to ask somebody about organizations that they belong to, we should be very specific that we're asking about organizations that are related to the job. So, if we say something like list all clubs and societies and organizations to which you belong, the person may end up disclosing memberships that reflect ethnic background, that reflect religious beliefs, that reflect political persuasions and other things that we don't want to be considering in these decisions. So, and it's also unacceptable even in our context where we know that our organization is generally union affiliated, that we can't ask questions about union. And union issues, even here where we know that these are applicants to, generally speaking, to an apprenticeship program that's sponsored in part with a union affiliation, that's fine, because we're not going to ask people if they're union or not. Obviously, I think we have a pretty good idea of where things are headed here. So it's not like a factory who's hiring people and, thinking about whether the applicants might be interested in a union or not. But we also have to be careful about, degrees of union, so to speak. So we're not asking individuals questions about their history in the union, how long have you been a member of a union, have you been a member of a union before, what do you think about the union, have you ever participated in a grievance, have you ever participated in a charge with the NLRB, and what do you think about right to work? If we hired you, would you pay union dues or would you choose not to? Those kind of questions are not a lawful basis to make a hiring decision, and frankly, they're not things we want to know. One other thing is to think about a little bit going into an interview process is being prepared for some of the questions that the applicant may ask you, so that you have some of what you want to say. Because one of the things that really gets us in trouble in many contexts is when we're forced to speak on a subject we're not prepared to discuss or put on the spot. So, common questions that you want to be prepared to answer are going to be things like, well, what's the job like? Describe the job to me. Are there advancement opportunities? I'm really interested in, long-term and future career development. What opportunities are out there? If I accept this job and I do really well for a period of years, what can I expect in terms of future opportunities? Those are kind of questions that an applicant may ask. Will the job be personally fulfilling? Those kind of questions are kind of touchy-feely, but they do come.
Have many applicants that you've ever had, Dave? Has anyone ever asked that question?
Oh, I'm all about the touchy-feely.
Yeah. So yeah, you want to be prepared to explain to them that this job will satisfy their soul in every way. And you may get questions about the company's economic outlook. Do you anticipate any layoffs in the future? How's the company's health? Is there job security here? So here's just an example of the kind of thing that can come up. And this describes a hypothetical where a really well-qualified applicant in the middle of the interview says, look, I'm really concerned about the future. I've heard of some employers that just let people go for no reason. I really want to go somewhere where I'm secure. Is there job security here? And the person conducting the interview says to the applicant, look, don't worry about it. This company never fires anybody unless they engage in really serious misconduct. Is that a problem is the question. And what do you think, Dave?
I would guess it's a problem because you're kind of putting out a scenario that may or may not be true.
Exactly. And the concern here is, the state of Wisconsin is what we call an at-will employment state, so where an individual is employed at will, meaning they can quit anytime they want and they can be fired anytime they want, or anytime the employer wants, as long as it's not for an illegal reason. And obviously when that's modified by an employment contract or a union contract, that can change the rules. But often we have probationary periods and different rules that apply to an apprenticeship program, things like that. We don't want to make any promises to this individual that are going to be considered contractual promises. Well, you told me that I couldn't be fired unless I engaged in serious misconduct, and I was late the first 2 days of work, and you told me I was done. That's not serious misconduct, so I'm going to sue you for breach of contract. You promised me that I wouldn't be fired unless I engaged in serious misconduct. So we want to avoid any of those kind of representations. And we want to document a little bit. Why do we want to do that? Well, part of it is to ensure that we're doing things consistently. and to make a record of the event. So we asked this question, we received this answer. We don't want to go into super detailed reports. And as this mentions, it also permits us to review the record before we make a decision. So you may interview 4 or 5, maybe more applicants. You're trying to remember who's who, the pros and cons of each candidate. So it gives you some notes to go back to rather than trying to go from memory. And it also helps defend management actions when you interview 10 people and you hire one, and one of the other 9 runs in and files a complaint with the state of Wisconsin or with the EEOC and says, I wasn't hired for the following illegal reason because of my age, because of my gender, because of my race. We can go back to that record and say, no, you know what, here I remember what happened. We had an interview and the person yelled at me or whatever. Or the person had no experience in this important area and the person we did hire had a great deal of experience. Or this person hadn't completed a training course that we require and the other applicant did. We want to make sure that we have a record of what was discussed. And if the applicant accuses us of asking a particular question in an interview that we didn't ask, maybe our notes will help us demonstrate that because we have a record of what we asked and that's not in there, and that helps support our statement. So who's supposed to be making documentation of this? Well, obviously the person who's involved in interviewing is going to need to be. And hopefully, if you're able to have more than one person participate in an interview, that's a good practice because you can have one person who's conducting the interview and another person who's observing as a witness but also able to take a little bit of notes in a way that you can't do if you're fully engaged in a conversation. So when do we want to take notes? Well, during the interview or immediately after. To the extent that we can. And what are we going to record? Facts. Questions that we asked, answers that we got, things that happened. Not a lot of opinions do we want to record in here. Obviously there are some things that you're going to end up maybe wanting to make a note of that are in your opinion, that the individual maybe could not communicate effectively or they were not able to organize their thoughts and communicate a complicated, or a complicated response to a complex question. If those are the kind of things that are important for that job, you may want to make a note that the individual, didn't perform very well. But in terms of descriptions of the person, their physical appearance, those kinds of things we want to avoid. And confidentiality, generally we want to discuss applicants only with those people who need to know. So people who are involved in the hiring decision. To discuss the background and the information that you get from the applicant. It's not something we want to be publicizing or sharing generally to say, hey, you won't believe what happened in this interview today, to people that don't need to know. Are there any questions?
I have one specific question, and it kind of comes under the heading of, along the same lines of the background check discussion. In our business, driving company vehicles is often required, whether it be as part of the job. In my particular case, I'm generally hiring service people, and it is a requirement. They will be driving our trucks. For construction people, they may or may not, depending upon if they're jobbing but you don't know how his career is going to unfold. So, is it appropriate to ask, the insurance company before you would be asked to drive a company vehicle? The insurance company will need to review your driving record. Are you going to have any problem with that?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate. Yeah, and the context would be in the application and interview process. You would want to disclose that one of the things that we may require is a driver's license, and that you're able not only legally authorized to operate our vehicles, but that our insurance company will approve your operation of our vehicles, which may include a background check in terms of your driving record. And so we may need to do that and ask them if they have any objection to that. Because obviously an applicant who's willing to go through that process and can offer you the ability to drive your vehicles is going to be more valuable than somebody that can't.
Right now, as a minimum requirement of the program, you have to have a valid driver's license. But when they come then to the contractor, it becomes maybe a little more stringent in that. And I just tell people, if the insurance company says you don't drive, you don't drive.
Right.
And I'm pretty much upfront with them with that. But
And that's just something I think that you'd want to communicate as one of the job relevant requirements up front when you're talking about the job duties and the qualifications that you're looking for. Like you said, to disclose that up front so it doesn't come off on the back end as some kind of surprise that they've been offered the job, they started, and nobody told me you were going to do a check on my driver's record, and now you're saying you need to do that, and now you're saying that the insurance company rejected me, and I think maybe there's a different reason you're doing this. So I think the more upfront you can be about that, the more, more clarity you're going to have, and the less likely you're going to have any problem. But as long as it's really related to the job, that this is really something they need to do as part of the job, it's definitely fair game.
well, I mean, it's possible. That's where the gray area comes in. I mean, if you can get to work on the bus, if you're on a construction job site, it really shouldn't matter.
Right.
But depending upon which path your career takes.
I have a question that, sort of touches on maybe some of the residency and maybe some of the race issues. Because if you're doing public work, or if you're doing private work that's financed by a government entity, there are frequently residency requirements attached. So for example, the city of Milwaukee has the RPP requirement, MPS has COIN, and then MMSD has its own residency requirements. How do you if you're doing one of those jobs and you want to know if somebody qualifies for one of those programs or is certified, how do you ask about that without accidentally wandering into unlawful territory?
Well, it is legal to ask someone for their current residence. And I think, in a scenario where it is job related, where you do need to certify to your customer, in some cases the city or the county, of an individual's residence, I think then it's clearly job related. But what I would do is I would disclose the reason for asking and the reason for verifying it, and saying, hey, some of our customers have a requirement that we have a certain number of staff that reside in a particular community. Can you give us proof of your residential location?
Okay, great.
And it can even clue them in that this is a great benefit to you. You might be a much more attractive candidate to me because you do meet some of these COIN or RPP requirements.
Right, and we know that those people are very desirable at this point. There's so many big projects going on in Milwaukee that there's a need to locate people that live in the the city limits to get them involved, and they're not necessarily that easy to find right now.
But conversely, if they wouldn't qualify for those and they're less attractive to you, but you can't, now you're in illegal territory.
Well, it's not illegal as long as it's job related. So once you have this legal requirement that you must staff with a certain percentage of people, or you have a goal, a lawful, affirmative action goal to include people that live in a certain area, now it's specifically job related. There's a legal basis for asking for that. That's not trying to determine, well, what neighborhood in Milwaukee do you live in, because maybe I can figure out what your race is from there. I mean, really what we're talking about is trying to fill a job-related lawful inquiry that our customers can ask us, right?
Okay. Any other questions, Dave?
No, I'm good.
Simone, were there any questions from the webinar attendees? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tim. I really appreciate this. This was very helpful, and thank you, Dave, for attending. And for those of you in the audience who attended today, we made a recording of today's webinar, so it's going to be available on our website shortly, so you can watch. And if you have any follow-up questions about anything, feel free to direct them to me, and I can try to get an answer for them.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Have a great day.